Welcome to Finding Avalon, the podcast that amplifies disabled voices. I'm your host, Jenna, a disability inclusion advocate, communicator, and storyteller. This is a place where disabled folks correct the narrative by sharing authentic lived experiences. Join me as we explore life with disability through our lens, because representation matters. Hello, Finding Avalon friends. Welcome back to another episode. We're well into our very first season with no shortage of interest or incredible stories to showcase, and I feel very grateful and thrilled by how quickly this podcast has grown. As you know, Finding Avalon is a place where I feature the work and wisdom of disabled people, as well as our community allies, one story at a time. On this episode, we're joined by a special guest all the way from Scotland, Gemma Gray. Gemma is a PhD student investigating the intersection of autistic women and menopause in the workplace. She's also a founder, Churchill Fellow, board member, and strategic marketeer. 10 years ago, Gemma founded Coloring Outside the Lines, a peer-to-peer support group for parents of autistic girls, which now has over 6,500 members worldwide. She's passionate about sharing knowledge and ideas for how to raise autistic girls to thrive. In 2023, Gemma received her own autism diagnosis and is focused on adding lived experience knowledge to academic research relating to autistic women in the hope of destigmatizing autism and increasing awareness of the experiences of late diagnosed autistic women. Last year, Gemma's Churchill Fellowship that uncovered social and employment opportunities for autistic women took her to Canada and the United States, where she presented and facilitated a number of focus groups. When she's not working, Gemma can be found walking in the great Scottish outdoors with her husband, daughter, and faithful whippets, sampling whiskey and singing the praises of life in Scotland. Welcome, Gemma.
What an incredible introduction. I'm so delighted to be here. Thank you for having me.
I'm thrilled that I have you on the show with me. And in fact, ever since meeting you through Autism Canada's awesome conference and listening to your own podcast, you've really impacted my advocacy work on a personal level as another late discovered autistic woman.
It's so nice to hear something like that. And sometimes we're not really aware of the impact that we have on other people's lives. You know, we don't do these things for glory. We do these things to support the next generation and support each other. So thank you for those very kind words. And I completely agree. Late diagnosed autistic women, when you get them together in a room, it's pretty exciting stuff happens. Very caring, very thoughtful, and quite intuitive as well.
Just chatting with you about my process of getting the Finding Avalon podcast off the ground, it helped me immensely. I was having so many doubts. First, with my aversion to hearing my own voice played back to me. I hated it. I still do. But also with my struggles with masking my natural Irish Newfoundland accent by covering it over with a broader Canadianized version of my voice, which is yet another mask that suppresses me, steals away my true identity, and that's thanks to the enduring, unfortunate xenophobia that Newfoundlanders experience on the mainland of Canada. So hopefully I can feel safe enough to unmask that part of me too once I get more used to podcasting. Because my normal dialect, that is the true core, that is part of me. I'm proud of my culture. And so people who know me have been listening to this podcast going, oh, I'm so disappointed I don't hear your accent when they see me code switching, because it is a code switch, right?
Mm.
And I would love to peel that layer off, that mask off too. So all of that to say, I had supportive friends and peers encouraging my podcast plan for quite some time. But the final catalyst came through the conversations I had with you. They were exactly what gave me that added push and confidence to launch the podcast finally. So I really have to thank you for getting me across the finish line.
I think that's so nice to be referred to as a catalyst, but you know, you did all the hard work. But as you said, sometimes little words of encouragement from an unexpected source can push us forwards and just give us that confidence we need. Everyone needs a cheerleader. Everyone needs somebody who just says, yeah, go for it. Because I think we have so many voices telling
Mm-hmm.
us the potential negative outcomes. But
Mm-hmm.
just hearing those positives can really sort of change the mindset and help us go for something.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Gemma, what do you say? Should we hop in with both feet?
Definitely.
Okay, great. First thing I wanted to ask you was, as a late discovered autistic woman, what was your journey like from self realization to formal confirmation with the diagnosis?
Mm. Well, I think for me, it has to start way, way, way back, as a child. And I grew up in a sort of really rural environment, which was heaven because it was peace and quiet and animals and all of that. So I had an incredible start in life. And I think I always felt different, other, outside the group. And, so that sort of would show up in friendships, or because we lived remotely, we didn't do many play dates. And actually, I quite liked that. It meant I didn't have to do play dates. But yeah, even at school, I can just remember feeling as though I was sort of in a movie watching myself for the longest of time. And so I'd always felt that. And I think I've always been a people pleaser. I've always tried to be perfect, do things right, never put a foot wrong. And potentially that sometimes you go with the flow. You let other people make decisions for you because it means that you don't have to go outside that comfort zone. So I think as a child, I'd always felt that. Um, but of course, if you don't know you're autistic, you have no idea you're autistic until a time comes where you suddenly start to think, maybe something's happening here. So my daughter was diagnosed autistic about 10 years ago. And going through that process with her, I had a huge amount of empathy for her, obviously, as a mother, but also she's just like me in many experiences and in many cases.
Mm-hmm.
But I think potentially for her, that sort of being at school all day long, trying really, really hard, coming home and just exploding was what happened for her. But all the way through, with her diagnosis, I learned lots and lots and lots about autistic girls. Turns out I didn't know much about autistic women, to be perfectly honest. Um, but I went along to an event run by SWAN, which is the Scottish Women's Autism Network. Great resource, even for listeners in Canada. Great resource
Mm-hmm.
to look and see what they're doing. And I was obviously in a room full of autistic women, and I got very emotional. The stories that they were telling were clearly resonating on some level. And I found myself sort of crying in the bathrooms during a break. And I'm very good at compartmentalizing, so I put that out of my head. And then I did a little bit of reading about it. There was more media coverage, there was more newspaper articles, and it was interesting. It sort of challenged my perceptions of what autism was, the traditional type of autistic presentation, and also sort of young girls. And suddenly you started getting information about how women who had been undiagnosed previously, how they presented, and a few little alarm bells, not alarm bells, because it's not a problem.
Yeah.
Alarm bells is the wrong thing. Let's say little tinkles
Yeah.
went off of me thinking, oh, this is interesting. And then I had a really difficult time at work. I had a sort of what I suppose is probably burnout, but a time at work whereby it was sort of post COVID. The colleagues that I were working with were being incredibly difficult, incredibly hard to manage, and I don't like confrontation. I don't deal well with confrontation, and I think it got to a turning point where I thought, what is causing this? Why am I feeling this way? So I spoke to a very good friend, Kat Stewart, who she founded Swan, and I sort of said, look, I'm thinking maybe along these lines, what should I do? And very helpfully, she is actually now a diagnostician. And the reason I chose to get diagnosed through Kat was because I wanted somebody who had known me for a period of time so that I wasn't simply assimilating my daughter's autism.
Mm-hmm.
I wasn't simply, I mean, that's the ableism talking, isn't
Of
it?
course. Yeah.
But I wanted somebody who actually had known me for a long amount of time and was able to consider that. So we went through the whole process. And as you will know, there's lots of discussions about childhood and discussions about how we deal with particular situations. And then we had our face-to-face sort of diagnosis or process, should we say. And it was really quick. And she was really honest. She just said, yeah, I mean, yeah, definitely,
Clearly.
clearly. And it's funny because, and I know a lot of your listeners, especially people in Canada and in the States, getting a diagnosis is very, very hard. So I understand that I am privileged to be able to get that diagnosis. And lots of people will be self-identified. It's valid. Do the tests online, do the reading, but it is valid. Whether you have a piece of paper or not, it is still valid. So some people sort of talk about how do you feel once you have a diagnosis, and a lot of people talk about it being a sort of grieving process, or they became angry for the life that would have been. None of that happened for me at all. I probably got into, I think I only describe it slightly as a bit of a sort of trance state where you just spend a little bit of time thinking. You let it sit. You let that diagnosis land. You think about it. So in a way, maybe numbness would be a good word to talk about. But then actually a bit of a thank goodness. That explains a lot.
Like relief.
So total relief, because at many points in your life, you think you're going mad because you're not thinking the same way that other people are thinking.
So true.
You get these messages all the time that you're, how do you come up with that?
Yeah.
Well, that's just how my brain works.
Yeah.
And so that, thank goodness, leads to, I think, a huge amount of compassion, a huge amount of, do you know what? Stop beating yourself up. In a way, you've been doing a double job your entire life. And so I actually found it, and research backs this up as well with late diagnosed women, as almost a cathartic moment. And obviously I won't swear on the podcast, but
it's
one of those.
No, please go right ahead. This is people swear on this podcast all the time. It's marked in that way.
That's good to know, but you should maybe never tell a Scot that it's okay to swear on a podcast. But but you actually, I think, get to that point where you think, oh, thank goodness for this. And it's no wonder a late diagnosis becomes a huge pivotal moment in many late diagnosed women's lives. It's no wonder. So that's sort of my journey from always knowing and always feeling different, or having to try very hard, trying hard. We'll come on to masking later, but
right? Yes.
Going through all of that, thinking, why can some people do this so easily, and yet I find this impossible? And then, that diagnosis was a real gift. It's interesting though. I don't openly tell people that I'm autistic, and that's probably because I'm only a couple of years into it. And, and you need to be confident and comfortable in a surrounding and in an environment to tell people. But it's been a great help and boost for myself personally.
Well, thank you for sharing that, and so succinctly too. It's amazing what you were saying. No listener can see this because it's an audio podcast, but I was nodding my head to the point that I'm almost dizzy because you're speaking what I have experienced as well. You grow up feeling so different and so alien, and kind of, I remember when you said it was like a movie, I remember thinking, are there cameras? Is this a joke? Is there like an experiment? And I used to look up and go, does anyone else see what's happening here? How come nobody else is responding, thinking, or feeling the way I am. And so,
Mhm.
therefore, I must be an alien that got dropped here.
Yeah,
And I did feel like there was either a microscope or a video or a movie, and sometimes
yeah,
feeling out of your body, watching yourself go through life. And then when I received my diagnosis, I remember feeling a lot of relief, almost like a matter of fact, sitting there going, mm hmm, my instincts were right. I knew it. But there was a lot more to unpack in that moment because, as you said about compartmentalizing, that's part of our coping and surviving, right? And so I can compartmentalize, and later the emotional stuff will come, right? Much later. And then suddenly I was going, oh, right, the stages of grief. Oh, I'm so deeply sad. I'm so angry. And then I go back to, yeah, but this is the truth of who I am. And I felt very comforted in that. That
mm,
instead of what's wrong with you, the message you get your whole life, to there's nothing wrong with me. I just have a different mind, different senses, and that's okay,
yeah.
right? Thank you so much for sharing that. Gemma, I'd like to hear about your thoughts on masking, which, for listeners who may not be familiar with the term, masking is the conscious or unconscious act of suppressing our natural autistic behaviors and traits to appear more neurotypical and to fit in with societal expectations. And women, especially, learn to do this to survive, but I think we can probably both agree it comes at a great cost.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. And masking also leads to mental health struggles and that all encompassing burnout that you just mentioned, due to that constant effort of hiding our true selves and trying to keep safe, and the stress that comes with trying to conform when we're naturally programmed to stand out and be different and think different and behave differently, which is not a flaw at all, in spite of what ableism in our society would have us believe. So, Gemma, can you explore with us what wearing a mask involves? And
I think the important thing to remember about a mask is it's not necessarily something that is permanent. So it's something that's situational. So if you're sat at home in front of the TV with your loving family around you, the likelihood of masking is pretty low. So that's where you can be your natural self because these are people that love you. It's a really sort of safe space to be.
mhm,
But masking sort of comes on. It starts when children are at school, and they have to try and fit in or pretend to be something that they're not. And it tends to be really unconscious. It's a subconscious, unconscious process that takes place. But it is very much like putting a mask on. So, whatever your emotions are behind the mask, you're portraying something which is acceptable and appropriate to the situation. Some people talk about this in terms of camouflaging as well. And, I think, again, really interesting terms. There's very good literature defining both of them. But it's effectively fitting into an environment that you don't naturally feel that you can fit into. So, an example of this could be you are going to go out to the pub with people you don't know, maybe a new book group or something like that. Now, every ounce of your body is saying, no, I want to stay home. I want to do something else. Maybe that's just me, but you
nope.
have, so you have all these thoughts about, oh, how am I going to be myself? Can I be myself? But what you will probably be doing is putting on a front. Now, it's not just autistic people that do that. Lots of people do it. If you're going in for a new job, you're showing the best part of yourself as opposed to
Mhm,
potentially your true self.
mhm,
But with a mask, it is definitely a protection mechanism as well. So, as well as showing this sort of perfect or idealized version to others, it is protecting yourself. Now, I really like my mask because I'm very, very good at it. And I've been
mhm.
doing it my entire life. So for some people, unmasking, which people talk about once they've been diagnosed or self identified, that could be very scary for a lot of people. Some people will choose to consciously unmask So they will be more of themselves. You're talking about that with your accent.
Mm-hmm.
But for others, you keep that mask really close because it has protected you this long. So it's a very personal choice of how people deal
Mm-hmm.
with it. I do think, especially for late diagnosed people, because your mask has potentially been your best friend for a very long time, you're left with these questions of what's the real me? Who am I? What is
Mm-hmm.
mask? And what is me? And that's a question that is pretty exhausting to understand and pretty complex because your identity has been affected by the masks that you wear. So I think that's an interesting one for late diagnosed people, especially, is finding out, well, who am I? What is the real me? And I don't think I'm the only autistic person that feels that. A lot of late diagnosed people have that sort of, well, what's me and what's construct? You know,
Yeah.
what is actually the true me and what have I made up? But I think, as you can tell, if somebody is masking or camouflaging all the time, you're suppressing your own feelings, you're suppressing your personality, and you are trying to portray yourself in a way that is more appealing, acceptable to other people.
Mm-hmm.
That is exhausting. So it can be exhausting in terms of you go to a work event, you pretend to be the most sociable person in the room, you pretend to be an extrovert with the best conversation. You know, everybody thinks you're incredible at the end of the evening because you've spoken to everybody and you've
Yeah.
worked the room, and you go home and you probably go to bed into a dark room and you sleep for a very long time.
Yes.
So that's a very sort of familiar story in terms of this exhaustion that comes from masking and not being yourself. But it can lead people into really serious considerations of their sort of mental well-being, depression, because it is something that's always there. And I think because it is often an unconscious act, that is where it can really damage people's mental health and mental well-being, because it is almost like going back to that question of who am I? It starts to make people really question their own identity. Um, you said, you know, obviously women mask in many, many ways, in many situations. Autistic people do as well. But also, as we'll come on to talk about later, in terms of women in menopause, they're also trying to mask symptoms, hide what's going on so that they don't appear to be old or
Mm-hmm.
menopausal, which
Mm-hmm.
stigma. We'll talk about that
Of
later as well.
course.
But it's these multi layers of masking that take their toll because you're not just getting through the day like everybody else. You're getting through the day plus pretending to be somebody else getting through the day as well.
Mm-hmm. And
And
also trying to manage any sensory overload or any of the other traits that you're grappling with on top of it.
totally, and very much it is known that the later diagnosed that you are, the more masking that you are doing. And that makes sense, doesn't it? When you
Mm-hmm.
don't know about yourself,
Mm-hmm.
you mask more. When you understand yourself at a younger age, you mask less.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for sharing that. So we know that it has only been in recent years that neurodivergence in women has even been studied or vaguely understood, and that the traits and behaviors are so different with girls and women. So that's why so many of us, you and I included, ended up spending nearly our entire lives without that understanding of self and the support that we need as high masking autistics. Just because we're high masking doesn't mean we don't have any support needs, right? What have you learned about this? And what can you share with listeners who may have a limited view of what autism in girls and women actually looks like?
Well, I think the first thing is people sometimes get very nervous if they don't know about a subject. And so they retreat away from it as opposed to coming head on and finding out more information. So, number one, if somebody wants to know more, fantastic. People will have outdated, stereotyped, frankly ridiculous assumptions about autism because it all exists and it's all out there. And we shouldn't respond to those with screaming matches. We should respond to those with education. because if we respond with screaming matches, you lose the argument immediately. So this is in very simple terms, but when you ask somebody to close their eyes and think of an autistic person, or, as has been the trend recently, you ask ChatGPT or AI to come up with what does an autistic person look like, there's a white male trope. What I mean by that is the faces you will see will be male and they will be white.
Yes.
People think of quiet, shy, self-absorbed little boys who are slightly obsessive, who maybe know every dinosaur that ever existed or every train line or love a map. That's what people think of. Little boys who seem really quite happy within the world that they are within. Obviously, there's lots of presentations out there, so I'm not saying all autistic boys are like that. Now, number one, autistic boys turn into autistic men. Autistic people grow up. So we can't just think of autism in terms of young people and children. We have to think, what does this mean in the real world for adults? Where I think things have had to change to understand a more female presentation, and again, bearing in mind lots of different presentations, some people who are female will present in a very different way, etc., etc. But let's just, for simplicity's sake, talk through this. Autistic girls, because through Colouring Outside the Lines, I've had the privilege of listening to lots of stories about autistic girls and how they present. They tend to be much more socially motivated than little boys. They are observers. They want friends. This is a female thing as well. They want to have friends. They want to be part of that group. So they mimic and they assimilate and they copy. Now, their hobbies, instead of knowing every train station on a particular line ad nauseum, their hobbies are more likely to be things that they've watched other girls doing. So horses, makeup, clothes. So it doesn't make people think of that little girl there with her normal hobbies, who is, part of a group. People don't think that means autism. So they've been hidden, missed, undiagnosed for a very, very long time. I tend to see two types of autistic girls in the main. One is that group who are risk adverse, quiet, perfect, people pleasers, and they get missed. Now, you probably fell into that category. I certainly fell into that category. And we hear a lot of those are the girls who get missed. And then you have the other who are risk takers, argumentative, disruptive. And they don't necessarily always get missed because they become across as a problem. So the schools where children are for the majority of their time when they're growing up, they want to stop the disruptive girls or, calm them down or help support them. But these missed girls, that's the group that I think are coming through to later diagnosis because they didn't cause a problem, they didn't cause trouble, all of that. And you may ask, why on earth has it taken so long for women and girls to be seen as autistic? And I think there's 4 reasons for that. The first one is a very, very basic one, that the assessment systems are androcentric. So it's to do with men. That's what it's been based on. So, of course, when you're asking these assessment questions based on a male presentation, well, guess what? Women are not going to score the levels they think they're going to score.
Screened out automatically.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So even if somebody gets to the autism assessment process, sometimes the older, outdated screening tools, it was that picked up on that male representation as opposed to female. That has changed, which is great. And there are new things, especially through Lorna Wing Centre here in the UK. But there are now different systems that are looking at those traits specific to autistic women, and that's coming through the assessment process. So outdated assessment systems was one part of it. I think as well, media representation has to play a big part here. So if we think of the representations of autism in the media, uh, there's not a huge amount of autistic women. When autistic women do come across characters, they're seen as odd and quirky. Um, Often it's very deficit led, so these are their problems. And with male representation, I mean, from Rain Man through to The Good Doctor, Big Bang Theory,
Mm-hmm.
it's that idea of, again, a white male who is brilliant in some aspect. And what that does is it adds to my next point, which is stigma. So that sort of media representation of people being geniuses, it's almost like saying, oh, they're autistic, but they're a genius. So it reiterates the negative thoughts about autism in the first place. So stigma, part 3, there's stigma everywhere about autism. The word autism frightens a lot of families, I think. In the UK, I mean, there used to be Asperger's was diagnosed, and now everything's part of autism. But you could hear people referring to their child having Asperger's because they thought Asperger's means they're autistic, but they're academically bright and they're going to be fine.
Mm-hmm.
So there were these sort of divisions. I think as well, autism, from parents, when they looked back at school, they would say, there weren't any autistic kids in my class. Well, yeah, there probably were. It's
Yeah.
just you didn't know that they were autistic at that time. So there's a lot of learning to be done. But there's still that stigma about autistic people being odd, weird, different, bizarre, intellectually disabled as well.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that stops people from coming forward, and it stops parents coming forward and saying, maybe we should be looking at autism here. But then also, I think the fourth one is ignorance. Ignorance on many, many levels. Now, world news from the UK, looking at conversations that are taking place, especially in the United States,
Oh, yes.
unbelievable
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
outdated, ignorant statements
Yeah.
about a sector of society can happen unchallenged by many. So that ignorance, again, I would imagine there's a lot of people in the United States who maybe a couple of years ago thought, I think maybe I'm autistic. Maybe that's something I'm going to look into. Bet you they're not looking into it now. And I think, that stigma, ignorance, media representation, and that assessment system, a lot of women probably think, I don't think they'll diagnose me. I don't think I fit that. So for
Mm-hmm.
me, what's really vitally important to me is that we have more visibility and more variance for autistic women so that we can counter these stereotypes. We need more women to be able to stand up and say, this is me. This is what I've achieved. Achievement looks very different to different people, but this is me, this is what I've achieved, and that they're proudly autistic. So, yeah, it's come a long way, but we still need to keep pushing. We really do.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I mean, I think I was nearly 10 years trying to find somebody who could assess a woman. I was told constantly anywhere I called, oh no, we don't deal with women. We don't deal
Mm.
with women and girls. No, no, no. Maybe call another province in Canada. Like, really, why don't you call
Yeah.
somebody halfway across the country? Maybe they'll do it. And even then, there were long, long wait lists, and the cost was so high. And I just remember thinking, this is not accessible for
Mm.
me.
Mm.
And I get that feedback of, why would you want to label yourself? Why,
Yeah.
you're doing okay in life. You're doing great things, but they didn't see what I was going through behind the mask,
Yeah.
behind closed doors.
Yeah.
And when you mentioned about your daughter, when she would come home from school and then it would be like an explosion or a meltdown, there's also that missing piece where in school you could be the good girl, the
Mm-hmm.
overachiever, the gifted kid, and
Mm.
then at home completely melt down, turn into that angry teenager who's exploding, those kinds of things, right?
Yeah.
Because you're masking for so long, your pen is all pent up, and then boom, it comes out when you are in what should feel like the safe space. There's
Yeah.
so many things you touched on there that are so important. Thank you for that, Gemma. Intersectionality is so important when it comes to any disabled person's day to day lived experience. And the way that I understand intersectionality is that every person has layers of different social identities, and this can complicate or amplify their individual experiences of discrimination and oppression. I like to frame it as a unique lens, almost like a kaleidoscope that shows the very different ways a person can experience the world, but also how the world responds to them in return, which unfortunately often ends up exclusionary and discriminating against disabled or chronically ill, and in this case, neurodivergent and autistic people. And when our identities have these overlapping elements like race, gender, age, class, sexual orientation, and disability, those layers or lenses become much more complex and they can result in additional traumatic and ableist experiences. Gemma, what would you like to share with listeners about why we need to better understand and respond to intersectionality within the autistic experience and those systems of oppression that an autistic person may face out in the world?
Mm. Well, it's a great description, first of all, about how you think of intersectionality and that kaleidoscope. I completely understand. So, intersectionality was at first used by Kimberly Crenshaw in sort of 1989 or so, and it was initially about race and gender and the intersection between those two pieces. And I'd be surprised if she thought it would have such impact when she initially spoke about it. I think it was to do with the legal system. But yeah, it's about the fact that we are not defined by just one aspect of our identity. We are defined by multiple layers of identities. And it's that combination, exactly as you talk about. It's complex, it's unique. There are multiple inequalities at play and multiple elements of stigma at play as well. I think of it as well like a Venn diagram, very similar to that kaleidoscope where you have these overlapping areas. And if you think about it, if you use, pale blue for all of the colors, and then you have the intersection, where that intersection takes place, it's a dark, dark blue. And effectively, it's the layering of one description on top of another. So if you're female, if you are female autistic, if you are female autistic going through the menopause, female autistic disabled, whatever it may be, the sort of stigmatized groups, it's that layering. Intersectionality is not without its critics. So some people feel that it is challenging the sort of current hierarchies that take place. Personally, the more challenge, the better from me. But
Yeah.
they also think that marginalised groups get an unfairness, by, showing that they're marginalised. Suddenly everybody's going to open the doors and give them lots of money, give them jobs. This is utter nonsense from these
Absolutely.
critics, because that's not happening. But also, people aren't choosing to have multiple levels of marginalisation.
Right.
So let's ignore the critics and let's sort of ignore that debate and not give it any airtime. But as an example, based on the PhD research that I'm doing, so let's think of three women. So the first woman, let's say they work in a particular office in a managerial role. So woman A, she's a woman, she's a female. Woman B is female and autistic. Woman C is female, autistic, and going through the menopause. So if we take those three, does woman A experience less or more or the same level of marginalisation as woman C? Of course she doesn't. Because woman C has three layers of marginalisation, three areas of stigma, three areas of inequality to deal with. So that's maybe a sort of simplistic way of looking at it, but it's that multi-layering that changes people's experiences. And I think sometimes what people have a real challenge with is they say, oh, well, if somebody's female and autistic and menopausal, how much are they going to need to be able to be supported? People think in quite sort of capitalistic terms in terms of support. And I suppose we also have to think about where you are in relation to the norm. What is the perfect norm? What is the ideal norm? and how far are you removed away from that? Not through anything you've done, but just simply through who you are and how you experience the world. And, there is huge amounts of oppression, inequalities out there. And one area that we can see that specifically is within the workplace. The workplace is unachievable for many autistic people. The workplace is a challenging place for many autistic people. The workplace is a challenging place for lots of people for lots of different reasons. But even from those very first elements of reading a job description and thinking, am I going to apply, to the interview process, to the way in which job performance is measured, there is massive inequalities. And the statistics of the number of autistic people in employment in comparison to the disabled community are shocking. They really are shocking. So more work needs to happen there. But intersectionality, we can look at it in day-to-day lives, we can apply it to work, we can apply it to lots and lots of different areas, but it is a brilliant lens, as you said, for being able to see how multi-layered inequalities affect people. It's not just 1 + 1 = 2, it's normally 1 + 1 = 3 and 4 and 5. Hopefully that makes sense.
Absolutely, it does. Thank you so much for explaining that in such clear terms. And I know listeners are going to find that enlightening because we don't always think about the different layers that someone's experience and identity bring. And I think that's very, very useful. What can you tell us, Gemma, from your personal and professional experience about raising autistic girls to thrive, not just survive and blend in like I did and like you probably did, but to truly thrive and enjoy life and to be safe to do that?
Well, I think a lot of this comes from colouring outside the lines. So, as you said earlier, this is it's a private Facebook group, and it was really set up by me when my daughter was going through the diagnosis, and I thought, I wonder if there's anyone else I can talk to, because parents often feel very alone, very isolated. They're thinking what's going on. The resources aren't there for them. So parents are in a pretty scary place at that point as well. So the experiences from colouring outside the lines, you get a lot of people who are new to autism, have never really heard about it, thought about it. And so they tend to come into it thinking that there is a problem because school says we need to have a chat. So they'll have phrases like, something's not quite right. Is there something going on at home? She doesn't seem to be able to make friends. So everything is pushed forward as a problem, an issue. The way in which that girl is behaving is potentially not what they think is normal behavior, whatever the hell that is, but from a schooling point of view. And also, we spoke about earlier on, some girls who at school are perfect, come home and there's what we call the Coke can effect. So if you imagine a can of Coke being shaken all day long, you get home to your safe space, open that can of Coke, and it explodes. Now, parents naturally, I think we're all programmed to see that behaviour as a negative and a problem and scary and worrying. So some parents come to our group really in shock, really having a sort of hard time getting their heads around what on earth is going on here. They talk in terms of the girl being difficult or ruining family holidays. And one of the first things we do is we don't berate that parent. We don't scream and shout at them. We try and help and we try and educate. And it's very much a self-policing group, which is what's wonderful. We get people to try and flip how they're thinking about what's going on with their daughter. Now, an analogy that I use, which may seem a little strange, but it's about an injured animal. If you imagine a cute, beautiful puppy, but it's been caught in a snare or caught in a trap, that injured animal is terrified of what is going on. That lovely, cute puppy is screaming out in pain is probably going to bite you, is probably going to claw at you. And what I mean by that is that your daughter is terrified of what is happening inside her head. She is scared. The world is a scary, inhospitable place. So from a sensory point of view, they're hearing everything. They're feeling everything. They're seeing everything. They're smelling everything. So they are not only exhausted from a day at school, but also pretty stressed and anxious and worried. Also, being at school, you have to put up with other people. I mean, who was it who said hell is other people? But, it's quite a
Yes.
great quote. But your daughter is trying to navigate these things on a daily basis without you by her side, her safe people. So I want parents to flip that narrative immediately. Stop thinking of this beautiful child in front of you as a problem, issues, etc., and start trying to think, my God, she's really hurting. What do we do to try and help? Now, there are lots of situations where you do need additional help, especially if children are violent and things like that. It has to be treated in a very particular way with lots of professional help. But when your daughter is at home, the number one thing is listen to her. Whether she's a little 6-year-old or whether she's a 12-year-old or 16-year-old, let her talk and validate how she feels. Because there's nothing worse than being a child thinking nobody's listening and nobody's validating. So even being able to say to them, I understand that must feel scary. Suddenly that takes a lot of the pain out of what's going on. So listen to her. If she's telling you she can't do something, it probably means she can't do it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think as well, the other one is work with school. I hear lots of people saying, oh, school doesn't do this and school doesn't do that. But on the flip side, you also hear people saying what an incredible experience they've had at school because a particular teacher has been amazing or a particular classroom assistant. Share it with school, talk to them. And even if you get outdated responses, oh, she doesn't look autistic, oh, she's absolutely fine when she's at school, just keep working on it. And I think as well, from a parent mindset point of view, and people have said before, oh, but you always talk about the parent, why don't you talk about the girl? Well, the simple reason I talk about the parents is because we are talking about minors, we're talking about children. We have a responsibility to look after and advocate for these girls so that they grow up able to advocate for themselves. And that's really important. So in parents' minds, get rid of comparison. Stop comparing your daughter's progress, journey, achievements with that person that they went to nursery school with. It doesn't do anyone any favours at all. This can be, oh, this one's riding a bike. My daughter isn't yet. This one does this. X one said this one got a prize for this. Just stop it. Comparison is an absolute sort of death of compassion. And I'd also say, get rid of unhelpful people. You will be surrounded by people who try and give you advice when that advice is not needed. And I think really just with your daughter, routine and planning and control and involvement is massively important for young autistic girls. So advocate for her and be emotionally intelligent when you're dealing with her so she can advocate for herself in the future. That to me is the most powerful thing. Now, I am no saint. We learn together. One of the most useful phrases somebody told me, which I think is brilliant, is when something hard is happening, get used to saying to your daughter, do you know, I've never done this before either. So let's figure out how we do it together. Because as parents, we don't automatically have all the answers. We need to be humble enough to say, I don't know. Let's sort this out together. I think that's a great phrase. I've not done this before either. Let's do it together. I think some of those things there help us to raise girls who will thrive. And I think thriving is to do with a path that plays to their strengths, environments in which they feel supported, and the confidence to be able to advocate readily for themselves from the minute that they leave the family home.
Gemma, we don't talk about menopause in this society of ours and its very real impact on women's health and well-being. We don't talk about it enough. We don't talk about it full stop. And especially, we don't talk about that undeniable connection between hormonal changes and the amplification of neurodivergence, and in this case, autism. I've got a number of female and gender diverse friends who are experiencing perimenopause and menopause. And when those stages in their life kicked off, their neurodivergent struggles became very, very clear, or they felt that life was so much harder to manage. Their traits and symptoms and just the challenges were harder. It makes me very nervous as the years pass, and I have to start preparing myself too. I've found that there's so much shame and taboo when trying to bring up this subject and to try to better understand the impact on women's health and lives. What do we know about the impact of menopause on autism? Are there ways that women can better prepare or cope? Are there resources out there? I have so many questions.
It's really good to have conversations about it, because unless we've got information, how do we know when it's going to happen? So I think, first of all, let's bust a few little myths about menopause. Not everyone gets every symptom. So people often worry that you're going to be having hot flushes and putting on weight and memory loss and mood swings and this and that and the next thing. Menopause doesn't mean you're going to get all of those things happening to you. So I think some people are sort of quite frightened about it and worried about it and think it's going to be a really hard time or completely debilitating. It is for some people. It's not a sort of easy thing for people to go through, because there's huge changes in terms of your body, but huge emotional changes as well, and lots of association with aging. But it is a completely natural process. It doesn't mean people are getting old. And also, people forget that menopause doesn't last forever. Menopause is a particular moment in time. Now, the reason it's important to look at menopause, especially for this generation and generations that come, is that this will be the first generation working through menopause. So let that sink in for a little bit. A lot of previous generations, people would leave their workplace when they had menopause. Some would have left their workplace when they got married and had children, and that was, teachers, nurses, that often happened to them. But we have a generation of women working through menopause and beyond. The retirement age is older than it previously was. It's a living crisis, etc. People are going to be working for longer. Really, really important to think about menopause, but also menopause in the workplace. That's a particular sort of passion of mine. Now, autistic menopause is different, yes, because there's all that sensory. So all those sort of sensory issues that people potentially have about dealing with their periods in the first place, that will happen within menopause also. But there can be this increase in social anxiety as well. So for some people who were socially anxious beforehand, that social anxiety is really quite heightened during the menopause. That can lead to depression. It can lead to sort of suicidal ideation. But I think it's really important for people to not think this is all going to happen because I'm autistic. There'll be some autistic people who sail through it with no bother whatsoever. So it's really important for autistic women listening to think, does that mean I'm going to have worse menopause than a neurotypical person? No. But there is a fascinating little fact that I absolutely love. And this came out from Autistica, which is a great organisation in the UK. Survey that they did, about 485 women that they asked, and 54% of them didn't know they were autistic before they went into menopause. And because they didn't know they were autistic, their symptoms were more severe. So the simple thing that comes out of that research is, if you are diagnosed autistic before menopause, you are more likely to have less symptoms than those who are diagnosed during or after menopause. So it's a really good call out to people, to women, get that diagnosis before you're anywhere near menopause. But it's a great thing about self-identification. Now, why? Why does that happen? It's probably because autistic women, I think, have got really practical brains. They like having info. You give them as much info as they can possibly take. And from that, they have all the facts. And once you have the facts, you feel more confident, more comfortable in what is potentially going to come up. So I would say definitely start doing reading, thinking about it. There is brilliant research taking place about autistic menopause, so academic reading. There are some great examples of studies that give some superb insight. People are looking at the autistic experience of menopause and the non-autistic experience of menopause. So there's some brilliant authors of this work, such as Karavidis, Brady, Mosley, Groneman, Piper, Jenkins, who's a Canadian. And the work that they're doing is really starting to bring some brilliant information for individuals to be able to say, what is my experience potentially going to be like and how do I prepare for it? So for anyone fascinated, go onto Google Scholar and type in those words, autistic menopause or autism in menopause. It's a really interesting topic area. For some autistic women, we talked about that social anxiety and that isolation, and menopause can become a time where people feel more isolated. And this happens for a number of reasons. I think social anxiety, but also a lot of the support groups that are there for menopausal women, often neurotypical menopausal women. So the way in which those support groups are set up may not really be very autism friendly. And so I think it's important for autistic women to connect with other autistic women. I know there's probably lots of online chats and forums and groups. That's great. Get your information from a source of people who you can communicate freely with and understand. So I suppose in summary, the menopause doesn't need to be seen as this big, scary thing. Yes, some people have a really tough time going through it, but there is support. Doctors are becoming far more aware of the support that women need. It doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be taking medication. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to have hot flushes all the time. And actually, one thing that I love within the research is what I call the glimmer of hope. And especially some autistic women who talk about menopause, a little bit like they spoke about diagnosis, of this slightly cathartic moment where they go, great, I'm ready for the world, bring it on. So, I love that. I love that sort of little element. And I suppose one little takeaway for people is that it is this opportunity for growth, reimagination, reinvigoration. Women live a very, very long time. We've got a lot of life left post-menopause. So do your reading, learn from others, and just be prepared. Preparation is probably the very best thing to do when it comes to menopause, but don't be scared.
It is excellent advice. Even personally, I'm like taking this on board for myself. I know I always feel like forewarned is forearmed. So, like, when I'm
Yeah.
able to ask questions of the people, the women around me, what can I expect? Get that research, because I am a data person. I want to know everything I can know. Maybe it makes you feel like you have a little more control, even though you don't, but it makes you feel like, okay, now I know. I
Mm-hmm.
really love that point. This is amazing. I know it's going to help a lot of people.
Good.
What's a common misconception about disability, and how do you think we can change that narrative?
Mm. I think changing any narrative is very, very hard, but I think it has to come through awareness, education, role models, massively important. It's such a huge topic, but I think one of the biggest misconceptions is that people feel that unless you can see a disability, you're not disabled. And that may sound very sort of base and very obvious, but there still is that unless somebody looks physically disabled, if you can't see it, it isn't a disability. It's not a real disability. And I think that is really, really challenging because it totally minimizes the day-to-day lived experience of a massive variety of disabled people. If you can't see it, surely you're not disabled. I think as well that people think that disabled people are mentally challenged, intellectually challenged.
Yes.
So let's say they see somebody in a wheelchair, probably their assumption will be that person isn't intelligent. And this is totally, totally, totally untrue.
Mm-hmm.
The challenge also comes not just with autism, but with disability of the massive, massive range of needs.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, somebody in a wheelchair, you can't assume one person in a wheelchair is like everybody else in a wheelchair. It's completely different, just like with autism. You've met one autistic person, you've met one autistic person. The range is
Mm-hmm.
huge. And I think people find that really hard to comprehend. Um, I have a little bit of a funny story about somebody assuming intellectual disability. So we use sunflower lanyards. I think a lot of airports do, and I use mine when I travel because I'm often so bewildered in airports that I stand there like a deer in headlights,
100%. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
not really knowing what to do, where the screen is. I'm a perfectly capable person, but airports seem to render me really quite unable and quite disabled. So it was in Toronto. I was leaving Toronto, and one of the workers there spotted my sunflower lanyard. So brilliant! They'd had their training; they knew what it was. And this lovely lady came up to me, and she held my hand and said, "Can I help you, dear?"
Oh, no.
And me being me, I wasn't going to sort of shake her hand away or anything, but I just thought, okay. So she then held my hand and took me all the way through. I mean, she was amazing. Took me through the airport, told me that my shoelaces were a bit long and maybe we should stop and tie my shoelaces so that I didn't trip. And she looked after me wonderfully, but she obviously thought I was unable
Mm-hmm.
to potentially intellectually look at what
Yeah.
was the situation around me and wondered why I'd been left there on my own. And that behaviour doesn't make me angry. It doesn't make me annoyed. It was absolutely delightful of her to do that. But I can
Yeah.
imagine some people finding that a very difficult,
In
challenging
infantilizing,
situation.
right?
Yeah,
It
yeah,
happens.
yeah,
I've had experiences myself where someone will immediately change their tone of voice and do a sing-song, almost baby type voice,
yeah,
and I'm always like, what is happening right now?
yeah.
Because there is that assumption, or that they'll speak extra loud.
And I think the other one that I would say is that there's lots of negative press. I mean, the media has a hell of a lot to answer for, quite frankly. In the UK recently, there's been huge amounts of press about too many people claiming disability benefit. And, oh, everyone's disabled nowadays. That's sort of absolute bull. It's total nonsense. You
Yeah.
know, maybe there are some people cheating the system. Maybe there are. But the vast majority of disabled people are not choosing to be disabled because it's somehow glamorous or you
Yeah.
somehow get huge amounts of money. You don't.
Oh,
These disabled people are simply trying to get by on a
yeah.
day-to-day existence. So yeah, that's one of the stereotypes. There's too many people nowadays that are disabled, etc.,
Mhm.
etc., and that's sort of absolute nonsense. And
Yeah.
then maybe the final point actually is about people's own internalized ableism, especially for late diagnosed people. Am I disabled? Does that word apply to me? Am I disabled enough to say that I am disabled? And I think for anyone listening who's sort of thinking about how do I talk about my identity, um, it's what feels comfortable to you. So some people, some autistic people would never use the phrase that they are disabled, even if you are disabled in certain
Hmm.
circumstances. So I think it's allowing people to use the terminology that feels right for them.
Absolutely. Whether it's the word disabled or not, it matters. That language matters. Our expression of it matters. Thank you, Gemma. Yes, these are excellent points. Now we're going to move on to the musical question. So, for the Finding Avalon playlist, what is a song or two that you enjoy that also speaks to your experience or thoughts about disability?
So I don't actually listen to a huge amount of music. If I do listen to music, it's often classical. It sort of gets me into a mindset that I really, really love. But the two that I finally settled on, the first one was one whereby I think music is so powerful. And sometimes when you feel low, you need something that just pulls you out of that feeling. There's nothing wrong with sitting and feeling a bit low and worried, but then having something to help you get out. So I love Pink, Cover Me in Sunshine. It's a really beautiful song that is about a difficult thing and coming out of that difficult thing, how do you build somebody up? How do you build yourself up? And I think having that ability to build yourself up when you need it is important. And then my second one, which I absolutely love, is Jimmy Cliff, I Can See Clearly Now. And I think actually, as a sort of reference point to diagnosis and what happens after diagnosis, it's great. His voice is just the most beautiful voice in the world. So, yeah.
And finally, in 3 simple words, what does disability inclusion mean to you?
True belonging everywhere. And what I mean by that is that I hear people talking about as Autism Acceptance Month. It really riles me, the word acceptance, because it's saying this thing's not very nice, but we have to accept it. So it drives me mad. Autistic people, disabled people, they shouldn't be accepted. They are part of the same society. So for me, true belonging everywhere. And I think what was important about that was that belonging is something that is so important to anyone that's marginalised. It's a place of safety. It's a place where you can be yourself. It's a place where you believe you fit. And true belonging, because I think you can be made to feel that you belong, or you can just innately feel that you belong somewhere by the environment you're in. And everywhere, because there should be the opportunity for autistic people, disabled people, to not have these constant barriers in their way, societal barriers, barriers at work, etc., etc. To be able to belong, truly belong everywhere.
I wanted to thank you so much for being part of the Finding Avalon podcast. And again, thank you for your encouragement and the support that you offered me to get me to the point of pressing the publish button.
Well, thank you so much for asking me and all these lovely, kind words. It's to be part of something, to be able to talk in this way is really lovely. So thank you for doing that and giving me the opportunity, and for really sort of pushing to have different voices and different people. So well done and congratulations on the podcast. You're doing a brilliant job.
Thanks for tuning in to another episode of Finding Avalon. If you can take a minute to help boost my show with a follow, share, and comment, you can help get this podcast to more people who can learn, feel seen, or maybe even for the first time, get curious about disability inclusion. Special artist thanks and credit for the unreleased feature song Coal Miner, written by Steve Hoskins, arranged by Naomi Kavka, and performed by Naomi Kavka, Bryn Porter, and Tony Kostelik. Thanks again, and I'll see you very soon.